I have a couple of things on my mind that I'm moved to say a few things about. About a quarter of a century ago, while I was teaching at the institution that was at that time known as Southwest Missouri State University in Springfield, I directed a community orchestra 40 miles down the road in Monette. One year, a young medical intern from Chicago was in town working at a women's clinic. She was an amateur cellist and joined the orchestra. I once had the pleasure of a conversation with her over coffee, and she said something that really stuck with me. We were talking about various issues of the day, including the awful economic disparities in the country and the miserable conditions that so many Americans endure daily on account of having ended up at the bottom of the economic heap for whatever reasons. Most of them, let's face it, having to do with accidents of birth. Keep in mind that this conversation took place in a region that goes solidly red every election cycle. No Democrat stands a chance there. The thing she said that came back to my mind today was this. If you'd lived all your life in southwest Missouri, in one of the relatively prosperous small towns like Monette, it would be possible to think that there's really not too much wrong with this country. No one was starving in Monette so far as I know, and people generally seemed to be pretty well off and to have access to the services they needed. I think that what she said applies to many places. The south side of Springfield, Missouri isn't like the south side of Chicago or South LA. But the fact is that there were many things wrong with the country 25 years ago, and there are still even more things wrong with it now. And there are enclaves to this day where it might be possible to go on blithely believing that all the system needs is a few tweaks here and there. That conversation from long ago came to my memory today in the context of a Facebook conversation with an acquaintance from Fayetteville, Arkansas, where I also taught at one time. Fayetteville's about the nicest small city you could ever hope to see. Very prosperous and extremely charming, especially the parts that haven't yet been gentrified. And most everyone there is pretty well off. If you happen to be married to a lifelong academic, as my correspondent is, and have a nice, robust nest egg all tucked away safe and sound, as my correspondent apparently does, and live in a prosperous small city nestled in a tight cluster of prosperous cities, as Fayetteville is, then it might just be possible to think that Hillary Clinton, a one-time resident of Fayetteville incidentally, would make a damned good president, since she'd probably do everything possible to protect the status quo. It seems to me that my correspondent is in need of an enlargement of perspective. It'd be easy enough to get. He could start by reading Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt by Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco. Or maybe he could just drive over to the tri-state mining districts, to those rotted-out lead and zinc mining towns where the current residents live in abject poverty, surrounded by toxic waste dumps. It wouldn't take him more than an hour and a half to get there. He could have a good long look into the eyes of children who have no future whatsoever. Maybe that might convince him that the status quo needs to be questioned. But somehow I don't see that happening. The same thing writ large kind of applies to the United States as a whole in relation to that large proportion of the planet's surface where billions of people are malnourished and lack clean drinking water. where millions starve annually as harvests fail, where indigenous people are cut off from their traditional ways of life by the ruination of their homelands, by fossil fuel extraction, resource mining, and the dumping of toxic e-waste from our spent electronic play toys. I don't think most Americans think about this at all, about the fact that 2/3 of the world's urban population live in slums with no municipal services such as electricity, running water, or sewage disposal. Unless you're stuck in one of those small, poverty-ridden towns in the Mojave Desert whose water sources have dried up and the only water you have access to is what's brought in by truck, if you live in the United States, it's possible to think that things aren't all that bad, that all we need are a few tweaks of the system and we'll get all those people fed and so forth. After all, this isn't Syria. Not yet, it isn't. Bernie Sanders' campaign represented something very important, but I believe my correspondent from Fayetteville views it rather scornfully, along with Bernie's supporters, as unwanted distractions at a time when good, obedient Democrats everywhere should be doing everything in their power to see that Hillary takes the White House. Thankfully, there are some Americans who are waking up, and the stupendous success of the Sanders campaign, a declared socialist taking more of the votes and winning more of the states than would have seemed thinkable a decade ago, it does seem to signal a sea change. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out to my liking this time around. But I don't always have to have things my way. I'd have swallowed the loss gracefully if I didn't have reason to believe that the deck was intentionally stacked against Bernie Sanders the whole time by the same moneyed interests who know damn well that their privilege and prerogatives would be secure if the Clintons were back in the White House. She's no threat to them. Bernie is. If Hillary Clinton is the next president, you can be sure that she'll be looking out for the interests of the well-connected people who put her there. That doesn't, of course, include any of my viewers on YouTube. Plutocrats do not watch the Atheist Codger. And the people who are in need of help the most, people who struggle to pay their bills and mortgages and send their kids to school or even find enough to eat, people still without access to health care despite our seriously compromised national health care plan, will get, at best, a small helping of squat from the Clinton presidency. The other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is this. Like most people who have an actual beating heart in their chest, I'm sickened and outraged and heartbroken and furious over that massacre in Orlando. I really don't have the right words to express that outrage and heartbreak, so I'm not going to make the attempt. I am going to say, however, that I very much appreciated those who have made the attempt and whose Facebook posts today have moved me deeply. One of the posts that I found most beautiful was by a Facebook friend who lives nearby and shares an interest in geology. It was a passionate appeal to reason at a time when a lot of people are behaving unreasonably and saying some really frightening things. It was an appeal to her friends and acquaintances to dial back the rhetoric, resist the rush to judgment, an appeal to look deeper than demagogues do. It is individuals, she said, who make those awful choices, and it won't do to condemn whole groups, Muslims, for instance. Of course, I applauded her post, and I hope it gets a wide reading and due consideration. The things she said are the things I want people to line up with. I want our national conversation to be conducted in far more considerate, measured tones than it's become of late. I find the current environment of xenophobia and suspicion and hatred to be absolutely toxic, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be the death of this country. That said, I think she's wrong in a fundamental sense, but my objection is more philosophical than practical. Like I said, I want people to believe what she has said, and I want them to act accordingly. Where I think she's wrong is this: heinous acts are not committed by people who make awful choices, because people don't make choices. They seem to themselves to have made a choice after they do something that seems to have involved a process of selecting between two or more options. That is, an act of volition. We probably all have Robert Frost's imagery in our heads at this point, don't we? We come to the fork in the road and we seem to decide on one course rather than the other. Here's the problem with that. On the one hand, we seem to believe that effects have causes, and we understand that everything around us is an effect of prior causes. And we even conduct our lives accordingly, believing that a particular course of action will bring about desired results, and thus choosing, I'm a prisoner here of the English language, those courses of action over others. If A happens, then, all other things being equal, B will always be the result. On the other hand, we hold people accountable for their behavior, as if they could have chosen at some point to behave differently from the way that they did. Our criminal justice system is grounded in this assumption. We punish people in part because we believe they deserve it. There's a stiff dose of retaliation in the sentences that are meted out to those who behave badly. So which is it? A little reflection makes it perfectly clear that both of those things cannot be true. This conundrum plagued philosophers for thousands of years until neuroscience finally settled it. And the verdict is, our sense of having made a choice is a post hoc rationalization supplied by our minds, which are in turn a process of our brains. We behave the way we do because of brain chemistry, and that way seems correct to us on account of our particular brain chemistry at any given moment. There is no act of volition in it anywhere. The sense of having made a choice is, of course, very powerful. It lies at the root of everything we imagine to constitute our very identity as moral agents operating in the world, making choices. The rationalization is not only very powerful, it has also no doubt served a very useful function, which is precisely why the trait continues. That's the way natural selection works. The brain has clever ways of papering over any number of things that we hardly notice, and in so doing it does us the ultimate service. It liberates us to be that which is uniquely human. The blind spot in the visual field is one good example. Can you imagine how many human generations lived and died before anyone even noticed it? I suspect it wasn't until someone first dissected an eyeball and understood the role of the retina and the obvious consequences of the retinas being intersected by the optic nerve. But would anyone living in a rainforest ever have discovered it? Another is the fact that the overwhelming majority of sensory inputs in an average day are filtered out of awareness. The brain is quite selective in what it is inclined to notice. This is, of course, necessary. If we were aware of absolutely everything going on around us, we'd be so overloaded we couldn't possibly handle it. We'd melt down in no time. Now, most people are never going to accept the perhaps unsettling news that there is no I there, no person making choices. For that matter, no soul, whatever that's supposed to be. There are only biological organisms running out their programs, and some of those programs are, of course, sophisticated enough to fool us into thinking that things are somehow quite other than they actually are. It occurs to me that this principle, too, can be extended to cover more territory. Consider, for instance, our various cultural myths. The myth of America, the city set on a hill. The myth of progress. The myth of human wisdom. These myths are all post hoc rationalizations, but they're very agreeable rationalizations, and so they have persisted in the culture. They have conferred advantages on those who embrace them, and this seems to corroborate the truth of them. But they're not real things. Progress in anything can be neither endless nor inevitable, and no matter how eagerly bloviators like Donald Trump beat their chests, the rest of the world isn't particularly impressed with our vaunted national myth. To most of them, we're regarded as a lot like the schoolyard bully that used to plague us, and a little ridiculous to boot. That's almost all I've got. Just a couple of random thoughts, not particularly elegantly worked out. In another day or two, I might be able to say it better. On the other hand, it may be that I'll have forgotten them completely by that time. I do have one final thing to share with you for whatever it's worth. Today was the first day of summer classes, and I met a class of 30 students for the first time. As always, I gave them a brief questionnaire to fill out so that I can get to know them a little better. The questions include, what is your major? Why did you choose that major? What 3 things do you find most interesting? What's the most interesting book you've read during the last year? What's the biggest idea you've ever had to come to terms with? And so forth. One of my new students responded this way to the question, what 3 things do you find most interesting? Jesus Christ, in parentheses, the Son of God, certain forms of technology, and electricity. To the question, what is the most interesting book you've read during the past year? His response was, the Bible. You can learn more from it every day. I'll say. To the question, what is the biggest idea you've ever had to come to terms with? He answered, one does not come to mind. My apologies. Well, at least he read some book during the past year. About a fourth of the class had read nothing and admitted it. A few of them expressed regrets for that. I guess even they recognize that they're missing out on something important. I also asked them to tell me their favorite joke. A lot of the responses were about as lame as you probably imagine they would be, but there were a few gems. My 2 favorites were Life as We Know It and What do you get when you cross a joke with a rhetorical question?